about 10 seconds to go. I'll let people just settle in. You know, I like that Rabbi Zarum got all dressed up for the program. He's wearing a tie.
Of course, when Rabbi Sacks taught, he would always dress decently, and so to honor him, I'm doing that as well.
Very nice. I am not wearing a tie. I don't think I even know where my ties are. If I wore a tie to my office, they would ask me, I'm so sorry, did someone pass away? Are you going to a bris? Are you going to, even, oh, no, actually, no one here wears ties to anything but funerals and maybe weddings. That's about it. California, Southern California. Definitely not to shul, not my shul. And definitely not online. Okay.
Well, my father is an old Yemenite Israeli, but when he came to England, he learned about the importance of wearing good suits.
Okay.
And Rabbi Sacks once said to me, I'll begin with this then. Rabbi Sacks once said to me, I know we haven't started officially. Right. He said, because my wife, as you know, is an artist, and she's got friends who make shirts. And I was given this really beautiful shirt, and Rabbi Sacks came afterwards and said, I really like that, Rafi, it's very nice. And he said to me once, Rafi, he said, I got a new outfit once and suit, and someone came up to me after service and they said, Rabbi Sacks, your sermon, it was amazing, but who's your tailor? You know, that's what he wanted to know more than anything else. Right. So those kind of things happen.
Okay, well, thank you for getting dressed up so nicely. We are getting started. So today, what is it? It is Tuesday, March 16th, 2021. One of my good friends, Peter Mesnick, his daughter, did an art project all through COVID, where every day for the whole past year of COVID, she just took an Instagram picture of a note card. It's the day of the week, and she put it somewhere in her apartment, and she shared it, and it became this phenomenon. And if she didn't share, people would be worried as to how she was doing. Also, people would lose track of the day. So I always try to mention the day. It's Tuesday, March 16th. We in the United States are doing better than you guys, I guess, in Europe with COVID. So we'll be out. We're getting, if you live in Texas, you're out running on the streets without your masks and going everywhere, I guess. But you guys in Europe are having challenges. So we wish you an exodus from COVID sooner rather than later. Our speaker for today is Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum, live from UK, which is not University of Kentucky. It's United Kingdom. Is it still United? Well, that's another story. Okay.
Just about.
Okay. And our topic is Jewish responsibility in the 21st century, the life and thought of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. It's hard to believe he passed away about 4 months ago. And we thought this should just be, we wanted to do a program. I spoke to Rabbi Zarum about it, and this is the program we're doing this week. And it's relevant because he's taught about many subjects, including Pesach, and I'll share some of his teaching, and maybe we'll learn about today as well, but I'll share in a post-program follow-up some videos on Passover featuring Rabbi Lord Sacks. A few special notes. We were very happy to share as well a program we did with Rabbi Zarum almost a year ago, because this is our second Pesach in COVID. We thought we'd be done with the first Seders, but we're not quite. And we had a special tour of the British Museum with Rabbi Zarum, in which we studied the Pesach story. So I'll share a link with those of you who are on this program. You'll get a link with that program. And then I'm very happy to have Rabbi Zarum's wife, Jacqueline Nichols, as a featured speaker for CSP a few months ago. And she recently, just a few days ago, released an art project about Pesach. That's very impressive. So I'll share that with you as well. I also wanted to mention that we're dedicating this program in honor of my parents, Aubrey and Rolene Katz, who, brought me up, maybe brought me up right. I don't know. I do all this stuff in the Jewish world, so that's great. We are all South Africans. They are definitely South Africans. They were born there. And they really loved the readings of Rabbi Sacks. I thought this is a great way to honor them. And I hope that they're on or will watch a recording of this program. If you're new to CSP, you can go to occsp.net. I'll put that in the chat. You'll learn more about us and our programs. Since this is our 20th year of doing programs for Orange County, California. The last year we've been online exclusively. This is program number 209 since we went online because of COVID. Over 31,000 hours of adult ed. And I know that Rafi will share information about his program in London and England that you're invited to. It has awesome programs and many programs for Pesach coming up that I think would be relevant. And hopefully we'll learn about that as well. COVID has been a big challenge, but also a great opportunity to study with great teachers and access to great programs around the world. Okay, the other thing I wanted to mention is some upcoming programs this week. So tomorrow, 10 a.m. Pacific time. And note if you're overseas, our time is now, we changed our clocks over here, so it's a 1 hour difference for like Rafi, it's an hour earlier in the UK than it was just a week ago. So Wednesday, March 17th, which is tomorrow, 10 a.m. Pacific, the building blocks of who we are, sculpture and installation with Hila Tuni Navok. It's part 3 of our 3-part program on great contemporary young Israeli artists with Shirel Horowitz. And we actually will have the artist Hila Tuni Navok with us. Thursday, March 18th, 11 a.m. Pacific, Meshiv HaRuach, a breath of fresh air and a prayer with Rachel Korazim. It's a session that CSP is sponsoring, featuring Elias Cohen and other poets, Sivan Har Shefi, Shlomit Naim Noor, and Hadass Shacham Sonnenfeld. They'll share their poems of love, gender, and faith alongside stories of their particular poetic voices. Thursday, March 18th, 4 p.m. Pacific, the Illustrated Haggadah as a reflection of Jewish history with Liz Diamond. Then Sunday, we're back for the part 3 of our 3-part series, the greatest New York City, the greatest Jewish city in the world, or actually in history, with David Kaufman. I think that's enough. There's a lot more coming up. Clive Lawton is back with us March 24th. He'll be talking about why is 5 the Seder number and why is matzah magic. So that's a specific program on Pesach. With that, I will say a few words about Rafi. We'll get started, or Rabbi Zarum, I should say. Sorry, apologize. Rabbi Zarum is the Dean of the London School of Jewish Studies, LSJS. As I mentioned, a great resource for Jewish education and now accessible more than ever before because of their online offerings. He has a doctorate in theoretical physics, a master's in education, and is a graduate of the Mendel Leadership School in Jerusalem. He's a sought-after lecturer with wildly innovative and meaningful readings of Torah, Midrash, Talmud, and the Jewish festivals that reference modern literature, cinema, and culture. Today, again, we focus on Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. With that, I will mute myself and welcome everybody.
Thank you so much, Ari. And yes, thank you so much, Ari. And it's great to be here with all of you for this event. And this one is quite personal. I will share a little bit of a handout of some photos and issues, but I'm not going to be giving a formal lecture on the life and thought of Rabbi Sacks from a kind of disinterested, objective point of view. He was my teacher, he was my mentor, he was my rabbi. And when I talk about him, it's very personal for me. So I will be doing lots of different elements, but it gets quite emotional when I do these things. There are lots of articles written about him, and short ones and long ones on the Tradition website, journal website. There's a whole bunch of books that he recommended and that people have written about. And Tradition's asked me to write actually a much longer article for them. It'll probably take about 6 months on his philosophical thought, which I will endeavor to do. But tonight is more of a homage to a great man, a very important person. And I'll try and give you a flavor of what he was like as a human being and to share. But we have lost a great one amongst our people. He passed away on the Motzei Shabbat on the 7th of November. And literally Shabbos came out and we heard that, that things had swung round and Pennsylvania was going to Biden, and we were all quite interested about that issue. And then half an hour later, I got a phone call that he passed away, and life changed. So here we go. This is a memory to my teacher, my beloved Rabbi Sacks. And let me share with you, first of all, here we go. Let's start with a nice warm beginning. So he was born in 1948. He lived till 2020, lived till 72 years old. I know he looked much younger for those who saw him, always quite sprightly. But this is 2 photos to begin with. This is when he marries Elaine in his 20s. And then on the right, that's the day he became a rabbi. He's lecturing in Golders Green Synagogue in 1978. He graduated actually from the place that I'm now the head of, it was called Jews College back then. He was a student here, then he became a lecturer here, and then he became the head of the college here. So this was his main place of study. And I'm sitting now in his old office. So it's a great privilege to be here. So that's him speaking on behalf of all the rabbis that qualified that year. That's 2 photos from that year. Let's go down to 1979 to 1991. On the left here, he became the Sir Emanuel Jacobovitz lecturer at Jews College in Jewish Studies. That's him in a dapper 3-piece suit, circa 1982. And then he became Chief Rabbi in 1991. And if you are interested, it's on YouTube. There was a 20-minute BBC documentary made, I'm sure you can find it, when he became Chief Rabbi. It's a wonderful 20-minute documentary. And what they do is, it's very clever. They intersperse the inauguration clips from it with personal interviews with him and his wife and his children, and where Anglo Jewry was at the time. It's a quite a dramatic event to see from such a long time ago, 30 years ago. But you really see where Anglo Jewry was and what he was trying to do, Rabbi Sacks. So that's a wonderful thing to see there. And one little story I have to tell you, by the way. So he became Chief Rabbi in 1991. Now, I don't know about you, but in most towns where there's Jewish people, there's a bit of a Jewish hangout for teenagers, right? And in London, it's Golders Green. And Golders Green on a Saturday night, an hour or two after Shabbat goes out, the kosher restaurants and bagel places are open on Golders Green Road, and lots of young people hang out. And who showed up at midnight a week after their inauguration? Rabbi Sacks. Got out of his car and started chatting to young people. What do you want? What do you want from a chief rabbi? And there were photos in the newspaper the week later. And the quote from one of these students was, "He's a real geezer," which is like, he's a real great bloke, Rabbi Sacks. And he was a photo of him with a whole bunch of young students and young people. So that's the kind of person he was. He really wanted to wake up the community and interact with them. So that's till 1991. He becomes chief rabbi in 1991 after being the head of the college. Well, here from 1984 to 1990. And then gradually, as you know, he became, beloved of the world. Here's an example of him talking to the Queen. She saw him as his chief rabbi, sharing a menorah with him, and then meeting the Pope as well. And he met some incredible people and was influential on so many levels. Just last Sunday, we had a big learning event here at the college, and I ran a panel with former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He was the Prime Minister after Tony Blair, and with Rabbi Sacks's daughter, Gita Sacks, and with Stuart Rodin, one of his close friends. And Gordon Brown talked about Rabbi Sacks's influence on the British public. And he remembered a time when Rabbi Sacks was invited to number 11, and they all gathered, all the senior ministers, to give a lecture about the importance of different aspects of society, not just the political, but the social and religious aspects of society. This is the kind of man who politicians phoned up for his advice. And I know of a story actually where Rabbi Sacks's book, The Home We Built Together, came out, and Gordon Brown told me this. He said, Rabbi Sacks mentioned to me on a Sunday morning, we were just talking, that this book had come out, and I didn't know about it. And he said, so I immediately ordered it, and I read it that afternoon, and I phoned Jonathan that night with my comments. And this is the kind of influence that he had because of his abilities. So that's just 3 clips of his life. The early years, getting married, becoming a rabbi, then becoming the chief rabbi, and then being the rabbi to the world. But that's not the way I looked at him. Here's how I looked at him. The man I knew, was a wild man. Every year on Yom Ha'atzmaut, in the biggest synagogue in London, Kinloss Synagogue, 2,000 people gathered for the Yom Ha'atzmaut celebrations, and he would always give an amazing speech. But afterwards, when all the politics, when he went home, the youth, the Bnei Akiva, the Zionists, went to the hall downstairs for an hour to dance. And Rabbi Sacks would always spend the first 10 minutes, go down, take off his jacket, take off everything, and just dance. Sorry, I get emotional. Like a wild man with these people, to show the young people the love he had of Israel. Out of them, and you can see the Bnei Akiva shirts in the background. And that's what he would do. He enjoyed doing that. He wanted to jump up and down and thank God for Israel that we have. Also, he would always come to the college, and we'd have these great conversations. Very serious, always very engaged, explaining ideas, always very funny. This conversation actually is available for free. You can find on the internet. I think it's Desert Island Discs, Desert Island Text with Rabbi Sacks. I think I did that with him. If he was on a desert island, what music or text would he want with him? Again, that's free, available on the internet. That's a clip from that. And then music. This is him singing. Again, this video is on YouTube. Oseh Shalom, a special version of Oseh Shalom. You get a whole bunch of children to do it. It was produced by Trevor Horn. If you heard of him, a great music producer who produced a lot of music by Seal and other people. And this is Rabbi Sacks' wonderful song to honor, I think, Israel. I think it was in their 60th anniversary of Israel. And the song has had like millions of hits on YouTube. It's a really wonderful video to watch. This is the man I knew. This is excitable, jumping up and down. And I'll tell some stories that relate to that very much. So that's a little bit about him. So let's a little bit about his life and who he was. And again, I could just talk for hours, but I will make sure we do the hour here, and I'll give time for some questions at the end as well. Okay, so 50 minutes in. Okay, so Seekers and Dwellers. Stephen M. Cohen, the famous researcher on Jewish statistics on Jewish research of community, talked about two kinds of Jews: seekers and dwellers. Dwellers like staying put. They're quite happy what their ancestors did. They quite like their synagogue, they like their rabbi, and they carry on as they are. And many Jews are like that. They're dwellers. But there are other Jews that are seekers, who are always questioning, who always want to find out what's going on, and will travel halfway around the world to find out. Rabbi Sacks, or young Jonathan Sacks, born in 1948, brought up in Golders Green, went to Christ College High School, not a Jewish school, was a traditional, not particularly religious, but traditional Jew. And his father worked in the shmutter trade, and went to a non-Jewish high school, as I told you, but went to synagogue every week, but wasn't that committed. And then in 1967, now he's in first year university. That was a turning point, as many of you know, for Jews, especially in England. Jews in England didn't walk down the street wearing their kippot. But after 67, the proud recapturing of Jerusalem, and that Israel could actually, look after itself and return to its holy Jerusalem, was inspirational around the world. And many Jews began to be proud of their Judaism, put kippot on and think about it. And young Jonathan was like that as well. And in 1968, he won a competition from the B'nai B'rith, which gave him money to be able to travel in America. And that summer, after his second year in Cambridge University, he was in there with Aviva Zornberg, who he kind of called his older sister. They would always go around for tea in her room and all that kind of stuff. Lots of wonderful stories of the people that were in Cambridge in those times. Simon Sharma was there as well, and so on, if you've heard of him, the great historian. So anyway, that summer, Jonathan Sacks, has enough money to fly to America and get on a Greyhound bus and go all over meeting his heroes, including the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Well, people who, they weren't his heroes at the time. These were rabbis who were supposed to know about Judaism. He went to meet Rav Soloveitchik. He went to meet the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he got again. This is a video, a conversation at 92nd Street Y, Ari, with Simon Sharma. I think it's called the Genius series. It's Simon Sharma in conversation with Jonathan Sacks, and I think the interview was actually some kind of comedian from Saturday Night Live or something. And in that, Rabbi Sacks tells his story of what he did that summer, and Simon and him in Cambridge together. That's a free video you can watch as well. It's really, really good. And yes, so he goes to meet Lubavitcher Rebbe. He gets hijacked by them. They won't let him go home, and he meets the Rebbe, and he asks the Lubavitcher Rebbe questions. But then Lubavitcher Rebbe turns around to him and says, "And what are you doing? What are you doing for Jewish people?" And Rabbi Sacks, well, again, Jonathan responded, well, he says, "Well, Rebbe, the situation I find myself in is that," and he gets interrupted. And Rebbe says, "What do you mean the situation you find yourself in? You put yourself in your situation. What are you doing for Jews in Cambridge?" And that was a turning point for him. And he got more involved in Jewish societies. He changed from doing political philosophy to moral philosophy. And he started studying. And he started studying in London, in yeshivas, and ended up here in Jews College training to be a rabbi. And his professors were famous people, Bernard Lewis and others. And when he was getting more religious, they noticed that this young, brilliant philosopher was beginning to wear a kippah and become more Jewish. And they said to him, "Jonathan, surely you don't believe all that stuff?" And his response was, "Well, think of me as a lapsed skeptic." And I love that phrase, a lapsed skeptic, right? It's wonderful. I'm a skeptical person. I'm still a searcher, but I lapse into faith. I love that idea that we lapse into belief, which is a good thing. We should have many lapses. And then he gets his PhD as well, becomes a rabbi, and becomes the head of Jews College. And then there's a big debate about him. Is he Rabbi Jonathan, or is he Dr. Sacks? Is he more at home as an academic in the ivory tower, or is he really a community rabbi? Because he became a community rabbi of the Golders Green Synagogue and then Western Marble Arch. And they always had these debates about him. What kind of person is he really? And they said the same thing about Maimonides. Maimonides, the Rambam, is famous for writing, being one of the greatest writers in Jewish law and in Jewish philosophy. If you ask any rabbi, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, across the world, what are the 5 great books of Jewish law? There's no doubt in my mind they will mention the Mishnah Torah, of Maimonides, the Yad Chazakah, the 14-volume book of Jewish law on which the Shulchan Aruch is based. And again, if you asked any rabbi in the world, academics as well, what are the top 5 books of Jewish philosophy? No doubt every one of them will mention the Guide for the Perplexed of Maimonides, the Moreh Nevuchim. There's no one else who wrote the greatest book in Jewish law and in philosophy. Jewish law practice, about how to live as a Jew, the practicalities of it, and also the philosophy, what is the nature of God, as the Rambam. And you will find when you talk to Orthodox rabbis or rabbis to write, they'll tell you, no, the real Rambam Maimonides was the halachist, the one who wrote the Mishnah Torah. That's the real one. And this philosophy book was just for people who had questions. And if you ask the academics and the philosophers, who's the real Maimonides? They'll say the real Maimonides was the one who wrote the Guide for Perplexed. That was who he really was, a great thinking philosopher who knew about Greek philosophy of its time. He read in Arabic, but he knew about it. And that was the real man. And that halachic book he wrote, that legal book, was just for the hoi polloi, the masses, just to keep them religious. And you know what I say? Unless you understand that it's the same man, you don't understand Maimonides. Unless you understand that the man who thought these deep philosophical ideas was also a practical, everyday living Jew, then you don't understand who he was. That ethics has to be lived. That's what Maimonides taught us. And Rabbi Sacks modeled himself on that. And he was just at his home dancing in the synagogue as giving an academic lecture in Cambridge University to hundreds of people. It's the same man. And that's the point. That's the point. And therefore he achieved what is rare, what I call integration in his life. He wanted those to be the same things. His Hasidic and his philosophical bent overlapped with each other. And as a result, from 1990 onwards, he pretty much wrote a book a year. And I know because I was 18 when the first book came out. My mother bought it for me for my birthday. And then every year I knew I'd get his book as a present for my mother. And as a result, I read them in order as they came out. So as a result, I've basically read every book he wrote because he had to write them, I only had to read them. And so I've watched his progression as a great Jewish leader from the very beginning. It's like those of you who, when Harry Potter was coming out at the time, you read them as opposed to afterwards, you feel like you're part of that story. And so I went off to Shiva and became more involved in my Judaism and all different issues, went to university, and eventually I found myself, I became the head of the college here after a stint in Israel. And he was my boss. He was the president of the college. And I got to meet him every 4 to 5 weeks for 15 years. And we would discuss politics and Jewish learning as well. He would always say, let's begin with a bit of Torah. And he taught me how to be a Jewish leader. And here's just a few stories about that, which I'll tell you. These are the punchlines, so you'll know them. And when you're dealing with leadership, and I'm sure everybody knows this, of Jewish communities, sometimes it gets difficult. People complain, people worry, people upset you. And I would come to him and often moan about someone who wasn't being very nice or problems I was having with different rabbis. And he would listen. And if I went over the line, he would say, Rafi, dignity. Always conduct yourself with dignity. And he taught me to be a decent person, basically. And you talk to Jews, leaders of the Reform community, leaders of the ultra-Orthodox community, no one will say that he was ever rude to them. He really tried. Now, I'm not one of these people that has a hagiographic idea that he was a perfect man, never made mistakes. He was a normal person. He went to the toilet, he laughed, he watched movies, he was a human being. But he worked on himself, and you never heard him putting someone down. Very respectful, dignified human being, a great role model to be. He also said to me, Rafi, if you can achieve so much if you don't take credit for it, if you take your name off it, and many projects that he did behind the scenes, he could achieve because he didn't put his name on them. That's what made a difference. That's what he would do. And I remember one Shabbat, we all went. He asked me to bring a whole bunch of young people for a weekend in St. John's Wood with him, future leaders of the community. And we had a whole Shabbat with him. It was really wonderful. And we organized it months in advance. And it turned out the Shabbat that it was Parshat tzav, Tumat tzav. And just the week before, someone had attacked him. When you're the chief rabbi, you're always, prone to attack. And someone was schmeissing him that week, upset at what he'd done. And we all knew to come for Shabbat, don't bring it up. It's not the thing to talk about, but we all knew it was an issue. And so he spoke to us and he began the Devar Torah of Parshat Tetzaveh. He said, Moshe is mentioned in every Seder of the Torah from Shemot onwards, all the way to the Zohar Bracha. He appears in every Seder, right? He's mentioned, but there's one Seder he's not mentioned in, and that's the Parshat of Tetzaveh. That's this week's Seder, right? And then he looked at us with a glint in his eye and he goes, sometimes, guys, it's nice not to be in the papers. With a little grin. And only a person on that level of leadership could understand what it must have been like for Moshe Rabbeinu to be challenged the whole time. And to sometimes, not being a Sedra and be on the sidelines is quite nice. So I remember that one brilliantly. And I went to many meetings with him, often, sometimes actually with Gila, with his daughter, who was a brilliant leader as well. And sometimes he would say things and I didn't agree. And so once I was very nervous and I said, Rabbi Sacks, I think you're wrong on this. And I explained why I thought he was wrong. And he had his whole plan. I mean, I was meant to run the meeting and he had his whole agenda he brought out. And I said, look, I don't agree with you. And at the end, I felt really bad because he kind of folded up the paper he had and put it away. And I said to him, I said, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to be rude. And at that point, he screamed at me. He goes, don't apologize for disagreeing with me. He says, I make mistakes and people never tell me off. And that's my mistakes. How can I learn if you don't tell me off? Don't ever apologize for criticizing me. And I was really taken aback. And I wanted to go, I'm sorry, but I couldn't say that because that was the whole point. So I just said, okay, I won't. He really craved feedback. And if we have time, I'll tell you a story later about how much so. So I'll tell that story about love in a minute, but let me tell you about his leadership. So he was very much a believer in framing a time, creating a moment that we live through. So it wasn't just life as normal, but we're living through a process. And when he became Chief Rabbi, he launched what he called, he read a lot of books on leadership. He launched what he called the Decade of Renewal. Let's renew Jewish life. Let's build more Jewish schools. Let's get more involved in our synagogues. Let's make sure we have Jewish grandchildren. And he created a whole bunch of projects to re-enliven the community. Now, a lot of these programs are the kind of programs that go on in lots of synagogues. But what he did is he framed it with this decade of renewal to inspire people. And it was very effective. You felt like you were on his journey. There was one young rabbi who told me that Rabbi Sacks flew in 1991 to Israel to talk to the graduating rabbis. And he said, this is what I'm doing in Anglo Jewry. Come and join me. And this young rabbi said, it was exciting. It was like a project. We've got to do something. And they got involved with Rabbi Sacks in that first decade of renewal. And after 10 years of that, he then said, okay, we've done a decade of renewal. My new vision is going to be about responsibility. I want people to get involved in chesed programs for society, to get more involved in their Judaism, to share with the world. And he wrote books about responsibility. There's a great, wonderful book here, To Heal a Fractured World. A decade of responsibility, of Jewish ideas of our responsibility to the world, to other Jews and fellow Jews, and he did that for 10 years. And then when he stood down as Chief Rabbi in 2013, he wrote a little booklet called Judaism Engaged with the World, and said, now is the time where the world needs to hear about Jewish ideas. And he talked about that, and Jews need to be engaged in their world. And so, again, he would always frame his time of what he was doing. Now, this story above that I want to tell you, this is now in 2003. I'm living in Israel for 2 years, and every year he would fly out to Israel to meet all the young men and women who were spending a year in Israel, whether in a yeshiva or a sem or a kibbutz, all those year off programs that high school kids do between 18 and 19. And there would be a big Shabbat in one huge place, a hotel or a kibbutz, where all the British Jews for their year off, about 300 of them, would come for Shabbat with Rabbi Sacks. And the 2 years that I was in Israel, he invited me to join as well. He said, Matthew, come along and do some classes as well. And it was one time I went along with my wife, Jacqueline, and he was quite tired over the weekend. And in the afternoon, it was a Q&A session with Rabbi Sacks. And he said, look, Raphael, I'm tired, you do this. And I'm like, they don't want to hear me, they want to hear you. He goes, no, just do this. And I'll sit on the side and I'll see. And I knew he was just going to rev up. So they asked a few questions and I answered them. But at one point, this 18-year-old boy stood up and he said, and you could tell he was newly religious. He'd been in one of these outreach yeshivas, and you could see he was kind of getting altered in his Judaism, was very, very religious and very serious and shockling. And he said, this is his exact language. He said, what does the Rav think is the avodah of this door? Let me translate. What does the Rav, he's talking about Rabbi Sacks in the third person to show respect for him. That's what you do when you get more religious. What does the rabbi think is the avodah, which is the work, the challenge of this door, of this generation? So it's like a standard religious question you ask, what's the challenge? And Rabbi Sacks, and I said, Rabbi Sacks said, I'll answer this, Raphael. And he got up to speak, and I sat down, and he looked at this boy and a whole bunch of boys, and a whole bunch of them newly religious, people who are on a gap year on kibbutz, all different kinds of people in the room. And he looked at these different people, and he said, I want you to love every Jew. And let me tell you what I mean. And he told a story of the Hasidic Rebbe, the Ahavat Shalom, Hasidic writer, the Ahavat Shalom, who wrote a commentary on the Torah. And the Ahavat Shalom would show that every Sedra was really about loving your fellow Jew. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is the philosopher Rabbi Sacks. What's he talking about? You know, he said, have you said about loving every Jew? And there's a story that the Talmud and the pupils of the Ahavat Shalom went to him and said, but Rabbi, what about Parashat Korach? Parashat Korach, where there's a revolution, a coup. People get up, there's Jews fighting Jews, wanting to take over, a whole bunch of them die. That's not about loving. How can you say that every said is about loving your fellow Jew? And the Ahavat Shalom responded, said Rabbi Sacks, and said, but if you add up the gematria of the first verse of the Seder of Korach, it adds up to Ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. And I'm sitting there thinking, I've never ever heard Rabbi Sacks quote a gematria. You know, this number, Aleph is 1, Bet is 2. But he said the first line of the pasuk is about love your neighbor yourself. So I'm thinking, where's he going with this? And then he said, and then the students went up to the Ahavat Shalom and they said, but Rebbe, we did the maths and it doesn't add up. The first verse does not add up to Ahavta kamocha. And the Ahavat Shalom turned around and said, I know, but when it comes to love, it doesn't have to add up. And then Sacks turned to these boys, who newly religious, and he says, when you go to university, I don't want you just being on the side. I want you being with your fellow Jew. I want you to know the names of all the Jews in your university. I want you to invite them to Shabbos meals. I want you to have chats with them. I want you to see them as part of your people. And I sat there thinking, that's why he's the Chief Rabbi. You know, he went from this kind of crazy story of a gematria and turning it around and saying it's not about adding things up. It's about just sharing your love for these people. So it's a great story that I remember. I have a list of 25 stories that I could share with you, but that's just a few of them. It's a few more ideas, and then we'll come back to some other stuff as well. So next, since we're getting serious, he did a panel debate at the college in 2011. It was a question of, are biblical characters perfect or real? You know, Abraham, the near sacrifice of Isaac, was he right to kill his son? Or when Jacob's castigated his sons in the story of the rape of Dinah. Basically, do we have to look at biblical characters as perfect, as some rabbis say, or can we see them as human beings? And it's often debated. You know, some would Hirsch and others would critique the Avot, and others would say that no, they're perfect. We had a great panel debate on a Saturday night with Yael Ziegler, Dr. Yael Ziegler, Rabbi Menachem Liebtag, you might have heard of him, and Rabbi Sacks. And it was a wonderful evening. Each gave a brilliant presentation. But then afterwards, we had the Q&A. And in the Q&A, somebody started just having a laugh and telling, just being a bit frivolous about Torah and about the Akedah. And even though we'd been critiquing the Avot, Rabbi Sacks had as well and says, of course you can critique them. They're human beings like us, right? He felt that the room I could see was getting a bit too frivolous. And I saw him and I said, Rabbi Sacks, would you like to say something? And he said, yes. And I have exactly what he said because we recorded the evening and it was typed up. And this is what he said in response when the room was getting a bit out of hand. And you have to understand, he could tell jokes. He was quite funny. He always began with a joke. But when he felt that the atmosphere was wrong, he got serious. And that's when you can really tell the measure of a person, when they're serious and they're politely rebuking people. And this is what he said, and I've got it here. He said the following. He said, and I'll translate the bit. He said, I need to make something very clear to you. You have to remember, this is a room of 200 people on a Saturday night. We'd been learning brilliantly, but we just had a bit of a laugh about some stuff. And he didn't want that. He said, Torah is Kihem Chayenu v'orech yemenu. That's a line from the davening in Ma'ariv service. Kihem Chayenu. This is our life and the length of our days. He's saying, the one thing we must never confuse here and never lose sight of is that Torah is our lives. It is the air we breathe. And the one thing I would ask of everyone is never to be flippant with Torah. Torah is serious. It is serious. It is about the most serious thing there is. It is about how we, imperfect human beings, can relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be God, bigger than the universe, further away than the most distant star, closer to us than we are to ourselves. Nothing we have said this evening, any of us, should make anyone think we do not take Torah, Hashem's word to us, with absolute and ultimate seriousness. Now, I don't know about you, look, I come from a religious background, what we call fum, but he didn't talk in a fum way. He was trying to say, this is valuable, important stuff that we're doing here. And of course, we can tell jokes and laugh at things, but don't lose the sense of seriousness of the project of Jewish study. And I remember there was a pin could drop in the room at that point. And then he continued. And he said, number two, never ever, God forbid, think that the way you understand Torah is the last word. Do not think you understand the binding of Isaac, the Akedat Yitzchak. Forgive me. Your question about it is a good question, but you assume that's it? I'm sorry. I've read every commentary I ever came across the Akedah. I've written about it a dozen times, and I know that I haven't even begun to understand. Torah is serious, and because it is serious, how we regard other human beings is equally serious. And that's how he talked. He then continued on. It's a very interesting conversation that he had at that point, but he reminded me about this. So again, I will be funny, I will tell jokes and have fun with Torah, but I'll always be serious about it. And I have that voice in my head about that he took it very seriously, what he was doing. Okay. Next point. Yes, I can remember as clear as yesterday. Next point, his books. So again, I'm going to be writing a longer piece about this, but I will send this handout to you so it's useful for you. The 39 books of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. By the way, he became a lord in the House of Lords, decided by the government. It was a great moment that it happened that actually he was there. It was on television. He gave his maiden speech. Again, you could watch that if you look on the House of Parliament website. But if you look up again, Rabbi Sacks' maiden speech, it's quite short. You might get to see that. And afterwards, there was a celebration which I got invited to in his old synagogue, St. John's Wood. And by the way, if you ever visit that. Not St. John's Wood, sorry, Marble Arch Synagogue. If you ever visit Marble Arch Synagogue, go into the Kiddush Hall. On the walls are 50 quotes of Rabbi Sacks. They love him so much, they chose his 50 favorite quotes and they printed them on the walls. And every week when you go to Kiddush, it's surrounded by these amazing quotes of Rabbi Sacks. So we're in that room, and he'd just become a lord. He had the whole outfit, all this wonderful thing, right? And he said, and his mother was there, right? And he said, it's wonderful to become a lord, but really, it's just an opportunity for me to give nachas to my mother, right? And everyone thought that was really lovely. And then he turned and he did this. He would do a very personal issue and then say something profound. And then he turned around and he said, but maybe for all of us, just living a Jewish life is just to give nachas to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to give nachas to God in the way that you live your life. And I just love that image that when you act like a decent person and you keep the mitzvot in a way that enriches your life, and you're kind to others and give to society, that you give God nachas and God grins. It's a lovely image that he said. On that grand moment I'd seen on TV an hour later, he's talking about nachas for his mother and about nachas we can give to God. That's the kind of person he was. That was when he became a lord. But anyway, I've divided his books, because there's lots of books out there, into 4 areas. So if you want to order them or buy them, you'll understand what they are. The 4 areas are his scholarly academic books, Jewish books for scholarly Jews, general audience books that he wrote, which again were quite intellectual, but could be read by anybody, middlebrow I'd call, and then popular books for Jews, and then his prayer books. So let me go through them and list them to you. And there's the year that they came out. You can get hold of all of them or whatever you want, but just to understand what you're reading. So the scholarly books, these are ones that are written for if you're interested in serious Jewish learning, what to do. The first book he wrote, actually, right, first published in 1986. Think about that. Just over 30 years old when he's, sorry, I'm getting that wrong. 48, 58, 68, 78. 88. Yeah, he's not 40 yet. He takes, now the Lubavitcher Rebbe had written many Divrei Torah essays on the Sedra, but none had been translated. And Rabbi Sacks chose 6 sichot of Lubavitcher Rebbe on each Sedra and translated them into really good English, right? Which often doesn't happen with Hasidic text. And it was republished in 2011. They're very proud of it, the Lubavitchers, right? The first book he wrote was actually a commentary, a ha-sha'ah anthology, translating in really eloquent English language what the Lubavitcher Rebbe was saying. That's what he first did. Then he wrote a book called Traditional Alternatives in 1989, which is called Arguments for the Sake of Heaven in America. Which is his background to his thinking about traditional alternatives, about modern ways of Jewish thinking, which is available. Tradition in Non-Traditional Age, his essays on modern thought, on Rav Soloveitchik, on Rav Kook. Some of his early essays are there. One called Alienation and Faith, which is fantastic to read, and about Teshuvah, repentance, and the challenge of wealth, a whole bunch of wonderful essays from his early years. Orthodoxy Confronts Modernity, he edited. That was a huge conference he did in Anglo Jewry in this building here. Brought 1,000 people in together, where he brought in David Hartman and Yitz Greenberg and Rabbi Riskin and all kind of modern Orthodox at the time to think about what is modern Orthodoxy in the future. My favorite book from this period, very hard to get hold of, unless you're willing to pay £500 on Amazon, although I'm trying to get his office to reprint it, is Christ and Covenant, a very important book if you can get hold of it in a local library. It's his thinking, his post-Holocaust philosophy, where he analyzes the different post-Holocaust thinkers and give his point of view, and some very radical ideas tucked away in the last chapter there, in Christ and Covenant. And then a book which is was published and republished, you can see twice, One People, his view of Jews together, what it means to be the Jewish people. In other words, even though he's Orthodox and others are Reform or conservative or not religious, he believed they were all one people, and he called it inclusivism, of accepting. He rejected pluralism and he rejected exclusivism, which is exclusivism is thinking you're the only one, and pluralism thinking everything is equal. And he argued for a different approach of inclusivism. I believe I'm right, but it doesn't mean that I can't include my neighbor, my different denominations, and show respect for them. And I saw how he would do that. And again, behind the scenes, the religious leaders, the rabbis of the Reform and conservative movements in England, called Masorti, met him regularly. And I saw that. And he had good relations with all of them and was never rude about them in public in any way. It's very understanding. So that was those are his books there. One People you might find is brilliant because it's a halachic work, halachic angles to it about those issues. And he brings in halachic responsa of real questions. Very interesting, because I know many people listening from different denominations. So he brings responsa from the 1800s, for instance, where an Orthodox Jew asks, you know, if I go to my friend, a Reform Jew, and he makes Kiddush on a Shabbos morning, and the wine is kosher and the glasses are clean, and he makes Kiddush, and I answer Amen, does it count? And the response Rabbi Sacks brings, well, of course it counts. If this person believes that God made the world in some sense and believes in Judaism, even if he's got football tickets on his shelf and he's going to go to a football match in England, we play soccer on a Saturday afternoon, even doesn't matter. If he's making Kiddush and he believes in it, then you can answer Amen and drink the wine and you fulfilled your mitzvah. And Rabbi Sacks would bring these halachic responses to show that we respect someone from a different denomination, that if they do something that's halachically meaningful, that it counts. And he felt it is important to reach out to every Jew and say, you know, I'm not a pluralist, that everything counts and equal. I think I'm right. Doesn't mean I can't accept you. And he was very open and honest about that. It's a wonderful book. So that's his scholarly works. And then he wrote more general works. Again, these are intelligent works, which are for not just Jewish society, but for general society. The Persistence of Faith, about which was the first book he wrote. This was the Wreath Lectures. The Wreath Lectures is it's a real honor to be asked to do them. They're published on the BBC. They're public lectures about society. And he was asked when he became Chief Rabbi in 1991 to do that. And by the way, his final book, Morality, which came out only last year, talks about these issues of what's the role of religion in society in general. Very interesting books. In between, he wrote a whole bunch of books. These are essays. Again, I've explained what each book is about. I'll just highlight The Politics of Hope, which is about politics in society, that our society shouldn't be run by the markets or by politicians, but there's also a place for social responsibility. Again, the reprint of that, Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister at the time, wrote the introduction for it. Fascinating. Celebrating Life. This book, which is a book his mother said to him, Jonathan, write a book that I could read. And this is what it was, Celebrating Life. Very short essays about finding life, finding happiness in unusual places. From his articles in the Time, a very easy read. A very famous book, he wrote The Dignity of Difference, respecting people who are different from you, which he wrote just after, as you can see, 9/11 and so on. Very important book to read, Dignity of Difference, about how to avoid the clash of civilizations, about globalization and diversity. A brilliant book as well. The Future Tenth is about a vision of the Jewish people and Israel particularly. The Great Partnership, one of my favorites, about religion and science. Not in God's Name. Again, these last three, if you're going to get, are really worth getting if you want to do a starter. If you're interested in fundamentalism and how to avoid killing in God's name, then look at his book, Not in God's Name, right? Confronting Religious Violence. He wrote a book about fundamentalism, the dangers of it. It's a brilliant book. Paperback version of it, only 5 years ago, really worth getting, Not in God's Name. The one about, if you're interested in religion and science, the best book on the subject is that, The Great Partnership, God, Science and the Search for Meaning. And then the final book he wrote, Morality, which brings all ideas together. How to restore the common good in divided times, to move from we to I. And again, there's a very simple version of it at his TED Talk. Again, worth getting hold of. You can get the TED Talk of Rabbi Sacks. And I spoke to him on the Shabbat. He came back from America. I'll tell you the story, right? I was there for Friday night. His daughter-in-law and my sister and a friend got to go to have Friday night with him. And he came in and I said, "How did it go?" He goes, "Oh, Rafi, TED was fantastic." And he told me, he said that originally he was just meant to give a lecture at TED, but they're very strict in TED about things, and you're made to come in advance and learn the whole thing. And he did the presentation. They said, "Rabbi Sacks, it's so good. Please, could you be the closing speech of the entire TED conference? Because your speech is so good." So he did that. And he said when he was there, and his assistant told me this, that they said, "Rabbi Sacks, I know you wear a tie, but in TED, we don't wear ties. So could you not wear a tie for your speech?" And he said, "I'm very sorry, but I'm a rabbi, and this is how I look, and I want to wear my tie." So he's the only person ever to be allowed to speak at TED wearing a tie. So even if you're not wearing Ari, I'll wear what I want. And that's what he did. It's a great speech. Again, it's a very simple version of that, a very simplified version, but it showed that he knew how to speak to the masses. So again, that TED Talk on moving from we to I, from I to we, so we over I, is that summary of his book, Morality. But again, the way to do it is you read one book and then you want to read more. But if you're going to read one of those last three, if you're interested in religion and science, The Great Partnership, he says at the back of the book, he says, he's so good at these lines. He said, science takes things apart to see how they work, but religion puts things together to see what they mean. And he talks in that way. Brilliant explanation of religion and science. And then again, the one about religious violence, fundamentalism, not in God's name, a very powerful book. And then Morality. Those are worth reading. Now, again, popular Jewish books. So there's a comment in the chat here, just looking at. I will share the list. Yes, I'll send this whole thing to you. Don't worry. Popular Jewish books. Well, we have Jewish grandchildren about assimilation. Community of Faith about the United Synagogue, the major US body in this country. Radical Then, Radical Now, which in America is called The Letter and the Scroll. A basic book, Why Be Jewish, which I pushed him to write about identity. His Haggadah. It's called the Jonathan Sacks Haggadah now. You can get hold of it from Koren. Magid ordered this year. It's a brilliant Haggadah because one half is a running commentary on the Haggadah. The other half is 20 essays on the Haggadah. Tehillah Fractured World. That's his book about ethics of responsibility. And then his Covenant and Conversation series, his commentary on the Sedra. Like Genesis, Exodus, these are all wonderful 5 essays per Sedra, really brilliant to read. And then, because he wrote every year about this, and then there are 3 which are one book on a theme, but on every Sedra. So his Lessons in Leadership is an essay on every Sedra and its relevance to leadership. And the introduction from that is by Senator, what's his name? The Jewish senator who nearly became in America, what's his name? Joe Lieberman, Senator Joe Lieberman, wrote the introduction to that. And then essays on ethics, a whole year of essays on ethics. And the last book that came out just before he passed away, Judaism's life-changing ideas. One key idea on every Sedra. It's a brilliant book as well. So these are all worth getting eventually over time. And then a book put together of his introductions to his machzorim, his prayer books. But those are listed over here, which again worth getting. There's American editions. There's the Kohen Siddur, and then his machzor for Rosh Hashanah, Pesach, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Shavuot. All great stuff. I want to talk about one more thing. I think this is the last page now of the handout, and then I'll take questions. Is this? Yeah, just one idea that I'll talk about: religion, Judaism, and general religion science, but basically Jewish wisdom and secular wisdom. Right? What's the relationship between the two? Right? I know we say that everything is in Torah, but the rabbis of the Talmud believed that there's 2 kinds of knowledge. What he called, now I know famously Rav Norman Lamb called it Torah umada, Torah and science. Rabbi Sacks said the technical Talmudic word for this is Torah and Chochmah. Now the word Torah can mean everything, but it also, in this context, when it's Torah and Chochmah, Torah means the wisdom from God, the Torah, whereas Chochmah is wisdom from the world. So, for instance, Deuteronomy, it says, Torah tzivah lanu Moshe. Torah was commanded to us. Moses commanded us the Torah that he got from God, inheritance to the community. So Torah is the knowledge that you inherit, passed down from us from Mount Sinai. Whereas Chochmah, look at this, how multiply your works, with wisdom you made them. Wisdom is what God made the world with. That's the knowledge of the physical world. which we glean through science and through physics and biology and chemistry, that we understand our world. These are two kinds of knowledge in the world. And Rabbi Sacks wrote about them many times in future tense, in different places. And I just want to describe to you how we divide them, because he made it so clear. He brought many sources to show this. But for example, I'll show you this table here. These are quotes from him. He said, Chokhmah is human knowledge, the knowledge that we work out from the world around us, whereas Torah is divine knowledge, knowledge that comes from God. Chokhmah is the truth we discover through research. Torah is the truth we inherit. Chokhmah is the universal heritage of humankind. Torah is the specific heritage of the Jewish people. Chokhmah is the world that is, right? What is evolution? What is Newton's laws? What is psychology? How does the brain work? That's the, we do science to understand the way the world is, right? But Torah is the world, is the world of ought, of commands. Science doesn't tell us how to live. It might inform us, you might learn moral lessons from it, but you don't want to learn direct lessons from that. If you try to learn lessons from evolution, you end up with eugenics, with social Darwinism, of survival of the fittest, God forbid, of limiting who can be produced. That's a mistake. Science is what is, it's not what ought. It doesn't command us, whereas Torah commands us. Examples relating to God. Chokhmah is what we attain by being in the image of God. Torah is what guides Jews as the people of God. Chokhmah is acquired by seeing and reasoning, logic, but Torah is required by using logic, but also listening and responding. Laws. Chokhmah yields descriptive scientific laws. Torah yields prescriptive behavioral laws, how we should live. Story. With Chokhmah, we cannot understand the human story, but with Torah, without that, we can't understand the Jewish story. And both, for Rabbi Sacks, were important. That's what modern orthodoxy meant for him. Torah and Chokhmah. That you should be just as learned in one as the other. And Chokhmah can inform Torah, and Torah can inform Chokhmah. And no one, I think, did that better than him. And finally, before I finish, here's a couple of quotes. I'll just read one from them, from a future tense that he said. He said, a Judaism divorced from society will be a Judaism unable to influence society. It will not speak to those who wrestle with the very realities, poverty, disease, injustice, inequality, and other assaults on human dignity to which Torah was directed in the first place. That's the purpose of Torah. Torah and Chokhmah must be reunited if Judaism is to recover its ability to speak to the world without fear of the world. I have argued for a Judaism that has the courage to engage with the world and its challenges. Faith begets confidence, which creates courage. That is how Jews lived in the past and should live in the future. He wasn't apologetic about this. He was passionate about those ideas. And I try and live by many of the ideas that he said. Thank you very much. Now, let me look at the chat and then we'll take some questions.
Thank you. Yeah, let me facilitate some questions.
Sure.
And people please do put your questions in. We have a few minutes. So it's amazing that everything you've shared and that you had such close proximity. So what you're teaching us is I know it's very personal to you, and we appreciate that you're sharing it. So first question is just who chooses the chief rabbi? We don't have a chief rabbi as far as I know, unless it's self-appointed here in our country. Yes. Who chooses your chief rabbi, and how do they choose him?
It isn't voted. He's technically the rabbi of the United Synagogue, the largest synagogue body, even though he's called the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth. But he is recognized further afield, as I say, by many communities. So it's actually chosen by the United Synagogue trustees, about 10 of them, but they will often appoint other people. They spend a year getting advice and ideas from around, traveling around the whole Jewish community, but ultimately it's their decision of who they choose as the next chief rabbi. And so Rabbi Sacks was chosen. It was quite a radical choice because he was young, in his early 40s when he was chosen, as a great scholar. But the more religious of the right were nervous about this young upstart. Is he going to do radical, dangerous things? But that's how it's chosen.
But for those of us who don't know, the United Synagogue, is that an Orthodox
Yes,
group?
the United Synagogue in England is the default. I know United Synagogue in America is conservative, but in England it's Orthodox, and it's the largest synagogue body by far. Of the 250,000 Jews in Anglo Jewry, about 100,000 or so are members of the United Synagogue. Reform is about 20 or so thousand. Masorti conservatives only about 5,000-6,000, and liberals a few thousand, and others Israelis and less affiliated. But the largest body by far is the United Synagogue, which he's the head of.
And who is the new chief rabbi?
That was elected in 2013. Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis is the current chief rabbi. Was handed on in 2013.
Do you think there'll ever be well, I was going to ask, can a woman ever be the chief rabbi? But you'd have to have a woman who got to be a rabbanit.
Yeah, no, but we have. But the current Rabbi Mervis has created a program called Mayanot, which are senior women educators who will learn to give shiurim and also to answer halachic questions on nida, on time mishpacha, on family purity and other issues as well. So he's finding his way of making women more leaders, and also every synagogue actually has a senior woman on the board, women's officer they call it, who's responsible to make sure that concerns of women in the community are taken care of. So Mervis has really pushed for that to happen in our community.
Was there any place of worship that Rabbi Sacks wouldn't go speak in? Like, would he go into a church? Would he go into a mosque? Would he go into?
He wouldn't go on a church on a service. He would go if a church was also a museum or visited for other non-ecumenical events. Then he would visit that. He wouldn't go to non-Orthodox synagogues, only to Orthodox synagogues. But he would meet in neutral places. So I know in LA, a number of the large synagogues or progressive ones asked him to speak, and he said, arrange an event at the JCC and I'll sit with you, we'll do it together. So he tried to find neutral spaces that made it more acceptable to do, and he would do that. But he didn't go, but he did go to Westminster Abbey once, I remember, because he told me that he saw where Darwin is buried there, and Newton as well. They're both buried in Westminster Abbey, and he got to visit there.
Do you think that his orthodoxy is different than, for example, the orthodoxy we have in the United States? Is he?
Yes.
In what way?
Yeah. Well, the language of modern orthodoxy is particularly American. Modern orthodoxy is an American phenomenon. We are similar here, but we're more what we call centrist orthodoxy. But Anglo-Jewry, you have to understand, in America, if you're not Orthodox, you won't go to an Orthodox synagogue. But remember, for those, again, I don't know America well, but I'm just guessing. Remember 20, 30 years ago, the conservative Jews, the United Synagogue in America was the kind of default setting. So you didn't choose ideologically to go to conservative. You were just kind of born into it and you went along. So as a result, there are more and less religious people. I know it's changed a bit now. But in America, Orthodox synagogues mainly only have Orthodox people. But in England, the default setting, the standard synagogue was the United Synagogue. So even though it's Orthodox and the rabbi is Orthodox, many people aren't religious, but they would never think of going to a progressive synagogue. That's just the one that you go to. So Orthodoxy in England was always very aware of people that came 3 times a year and always reached out to them. Now, I'm sure there's synagogues like that in America. I'm not saying only. I'm just trying to give you a characteristic of what that was like in America, in England. So, most synagogues were like that. And Rabbi Sacks knew how to reach out to the people. I always laughed at him and I used to say to him, you don't know what's going on in Anglo-Jewry. He goes, what do you mean, Rafi? I said, well, when I visit a synagogue as a scholar, maybe 10 or so more will turn up. But when you visit as a scholar, the shul's packed at 9 a.m. People who only come 3 times a year will come just to daven, to pray, to be near, to hear you speak. I said, so you don't know what's really going on. You think that all synagogues are full. So he laughed. But he knew how to reach the people as a result. Because in England, even though the synagogues are Orthodox, most people that go to them aren't. So I think that's a fair enough thing to say.
Did he have, was any world leader like the current Pope or the past Pope or another religious leader, let's say religious leader, that he particularly was close to or was...
Rowan Williams. So I did a panel conversation, I don't know if it's online, with Jewish Book Week, with Rowan Williams and Simon Sharma. And Rowan Williams was a big fan of Sacks, and he invited Sacks to speak at what's called the Lambeth Conference. It's the biggest conference of Christian leaders in the country. And Rabbi Sacks gave the keynote lecture, which blew them all away, and they were all quoting it for like weeks afterwards. There's this amazing speech that he gave to them, and he was very respected by Christians. And in fact, once, are you familiar with BDS? That issue of challenging Israel. So some fringe Catholic groups in England were getting involved with that, and there was a possibility that some mainstream Protestant Church of England were going to get involved with BDS. And I know this story because I spoke to his office, and it's all happened behind the scenes. Some of the greatest achievements no one knows about. Rabbi Sacks got in his car and drove around to the Archbishop of Canterbury and others and said, if you get involved in BDS, I will disconnect from you. This is the wrong thing to do. You should not be involved in it. You might disagree with Israel, but BDS has got political overtones that are not good. Please do not be involved. And they listened to him. They listened to him because they have respect for him. They wouldn't do that. And so he had the power behind the scenes to influence people and to make a difference.
Amy wants to know whether he ever discussed with you his thoughts about the monarchy, and any stories about him and the monarchy.
And the Queen. Well, I mean, the Queen liked him very much, and I got to go. There was a big event in Paris, but in terms of attitudes, so Prince Charles was a big fan of his. I think again online, Ari, when he stood down as Chief Rabbi, there was a big dinner for like 700 people, and Charles was there and spoke. Actually, there's a whole video they made about it. I think that's on the video. I think I'm on it as well. It's a video for all different people speaking about how important he was. And actually, it's online. I think on the Chief Rabbi's website, Rabbi Sacks' website, is the video that they made after he passed away, a kind of memorial, Shloshim. And again, Prince Charles spoke there. And Prince Charles really looked up to Sacks as a moral thinker, and he called him my Chief Rabbi. So he had influence on that, but he never got involved. And the monarchy was what was, and his job was to be respectful of it. So one of the royal weddings, actually, a William's wedding, was on. I remember Rabbi Sacks had to go. It was very hard for him because of security. Why was it hard for him? Because he was in Westminster Abbey, and in Westminster Abbey, because of security, you weren't allowed to take anything with you. It was a 3-hour service, right? And he couldn't take a book or an iPad or anything. He had to sit there, without anything in a church. So, which I know was hard for him. So he had to kind of think of ideas in his head because he couldn't read anything. And someone said to him afterwards, they said to me, how could Rabbi Sacks go to the church? I said, what do you mean? They said, well, it was during the 3 weeks and they were singing. How could he listen? And I was like, that's your issue, But people ask, well, how could a rabbi go to a church for the service? Why? Because the Queen invited him, and it was a royal wedding of state, and so you go. When he came out of the church, and again, this might be online if you can find it, he was interviewed about what he thought of the wedding, and he gave a little 5-minute speech about what a beautiful wedding it was, and he was so eloquent that the BBC and all the newspapers kept on playing his speech about it afterwards because he was more eloquent than anybody else about it. So he went to that wedding. I know we have to finish a minute and I'll take more questions, but I do want to end with the story, which I'll tell you, but we'll decide which one in a minute. But are there any other questions, are we?
So it's always lots of questions because we have a great audience, but we do have limited time. So people are very wired. And I said I would share your handout with them, if that's okay. So follow up. Because
Charles was in Krakow, absolutely. He opened the thing in Krakow. I'll take a couple more questions and then a little story and then we'll end.
Did you attend any of the meetings with him when he met with dignitaries? And if so, can you tell us anything about that?
So, I mean, might not be famous to you, and I can't remember his name now. He was the leader of the Conservative Party at the time. He didn't become Prime Minister. Okay, so I knew about lots of things, but it was interesting, actually. I thought I knew about everything. And then like a year before he stepped down, I got an email, Rafi, you and Jacqueline are invited to a dinner party at the Chief Rabbi's house. And I didn't know that these had gone on every month for 20 years. So I turn up, right, and there's canapes and informal, and there's famous, wealthy Jews there, politicians, thinkers, Jewish and non-Jewish, everybody chatting. And we sit down, and I'm not by my wife, Jacqueline, right? There's like names all divided up to sit with all different kinds of people, right? And we have this conversation, we're all introduced, and Rabbi Sacks taps a glass, right? And then it goes round and introduces beautifully and makes every one of them feel special, who each person was. This is Rabbi Zarum, who's a wonderful teacher in our community. This is so-and-so who gives to our community. This is Lord so-and-so. And then he holds a conversation with these 20 people, right? There's a formal meal, and he holds a conversation, intelligent conversation about ideas and the current issues of the day and make sure everybody's involved. It's beautiful. And then it comes to benching, right? Grace after meals. And he always taught me and said, Rafi, if you're proud and confident of your Judaism and proud of it, others will be proud. But if you're embarrassed and ashamed, they'll be embarrassed and ashamed. So when it came to grace after meals, he handed around, he had the NCSY bencher because it's got the numbers in it. And he would say, number 1. And then he sang with gusto, the whole thing, right? It's got transliteration and translation. And even the Jews who weren't so religious joined in. And he'd say 2, no, and just sang confidently. He didn't rush it. Comfortably expressing his religious beliefs, and everyone sat quietly and respectfully. And I discovered, as I said, those dinner parties went on every month with heads of state and religious dignitaries and private, wealthy, important people, philanthropists and thinkers the entire time he was Chief Rabbi. And it was an honor to be invited to them, and nobody knew about them. So I only found out in that last year that they went on. A wonderful thing. And that's how he had influence as well. And he showed respect to these people, which was a wonderful thing.
So, yeah, I guess the last question I had is who is working on continuing his legacy, and in what way, and how can people, I know there's a website, but can you tell us If any particular.
Well, we at the college have every 2 weeks we've got the Torah of Rabbi Sacks, where a different one of his pupils, students, gives a lecture based on his thoughts. They're on our website, and that's carrying on next term. And we have, say, Professor Daniel Reinhold, the professor at YU in Jewish philosophy, Talmud of Rav Sacks. Dr. Erica Brown lived in London for a number of years. Erica studied under Rabbi Sacks. Who we got from England, Rabbi Dr. Michael Harris as well is speaking. People from all over the world, Rabbi Alex Israel and Pardes, all his pupils are giving these lectures, which is going on. We also, the trust, the Rabbi Sacks Trust, a legacy trust, which we're involved in, is developing a whole bunch of projects in order to keep his ideas and spread his ideas and his work. And you'll watch this space, a lot of ideas are coming out. So there's a lot to read and to see and to learn from, absolutely. Final story. Do you want the story? They're both exciting as well. Of when he stood down and Chief Rabbi and became the professor of Bible and law and ethics at King's College and that event, or and maybe go the second one is more emotional. The lecture that he gave in Cambridge University in the Guildhall. Both stories of which I know about. Which one do you want? Do you want the Guildhall Cambridge one? I think maybe that's a nice way to end. It's quite an emotional one.
Go with that one then.
Go with that one. Okay. So he was invited by Cambridge University to give a central lecture, which the professors of the entire university were invited to. It was like 1,000 people, the Guildhall, this major lecture hall in Cambridge, this important lecture. And it was an amazing honor, right? The greatest university in the country to have the Chief Rabbi give them an academic lecture. But the great story I want to tell you is what happened afterwards, because it was the year that he was saying Kaddish for his father, and he wanted to daven Mariv. Now, Cambridge is an hour, 20 minutes drive from London. He was going to drive back that night. The lecture finished about 9:30, 10 o'clock, and by the time he got back to London, there'd be nowhere to daven Mariv and to say Kaddish. So at the end of this lecture, with these amazing academics all over, he said, if there's any Jews in the audience, could you stay behind so we could maybe pray the evening service so I could say Kaddish for my father? Right? And so we go downstairs in the Guildhall. There's like 20 Jewish academics with these funny kippot, not so religious there, so we can say Kaddish. And he davens, he leads the service, again, not rushed, not going on, but decent pace, everything. And in the corner is this old Jewish professor of history crying his eyes out. From the minute Chief Rabbi said Baruch Hu till the end, he's just standing there, not davening, just weeping the whole time, 15 minutes. And I wasn't there that night, actually. People went down, so I wasn't there. I was back in London. I met him the next morning, and he told me this story the next morning in his office. And he said, Rafi, he said, I went up to him, and I said, are you okay? And he said, Rabbi Sacks, I'm sorry, I'm overcome. He said, why? He said, you don't know, but there used to be a synagogue in Cambridge, and it was destroyed many years ago. And it was on the site that they built the Guildhall on top that we're standing today, was the site of the old synagogue in Cambridge. And no one has prayed as a shul to God in this site for maybe 100 or so years. And to see you, not just Jews are back, but recognized by the greatest university of the country as this great scholar, that Jewish thought is as respected as Western thought on a par, and that you did it, and then you're davening afterwards in this same place, it's just too much for me, and I just can't take it. I'm crying. And Rabbi Sacks felt honored that he could be this person that could do that, that could. Anglo-Jewry stood proud because of this man. I know you do as well, American Jews, that someone like this could be around. It wasn't about him. He wasn't ego for himself. It was that this power allowed him to work on the world stage and to plead the Jewish cause, the land of Israel, and to plead and to share Jewish values. And so that story is just rings my mind, that idea of these levels of these things going on. So that's the Guildhall story. There's many other stories. Humility, absolutely. Can I tell one more that relates to that, Ari? Because it really relates to it. For a couple of years, they had this question: who's the greatest English Jew? Right, and Rabbi Sacks every year became this one. And it was I was on a Sunday morning. No, it's not that. So it's a separate story. It's related, but different. So different. It was a big federation dinner. Imagine this: the big federation dinner, and they bring in, I won't tell you who, it was an American funder to speak. And the funder was rude about Rabbi Sacks. Sacks was sitting there, and he said, your Chief Rabbi doesn't do this, this, and this. And the leaders of the federation were so embarrassed. The next morning, they went to Rabbi Sacks's office to apologize to him. And they said, Rabbi Sacks was so sorry. Now, what you don't know is that the day before, I'd gone to him and said, I need a major donation for a project at the college, Rabbi Sacks, and I don't know who to go to. And he said, leave it with me. So the next day, these people come, to apologize, leaders of the committee, to apologize to him for what happened in the dinner. I'm very sorry. And they're apologizing to him. And he said, it's really fine, I don't mind. But Rabbi Zarum's got a project which you might be interested in. And I got the funding within 2 days. Any time something happened to him that he got attacked and people apologized or wanted to give praise to him, he saw that as an opportunity to help the Jewish people, and he would use it for something else. He didn't care about himself. It's like, okay, you're upset with me and Rafi needs project, go and do that. And he always was doing this. He would always say, use that as an opportunity to do something good. Don't care about your own ego. If people are thanking you, what can you ask them to do for the Jewish people as a result? He really was a special, inspiring man. I miss him greatly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing those stories. We only had an hour and we could have used a lot more, obviously. So maybe we'll come back. There's a lot more to unpack in the life of such an influential, important person for world Judaism. There's challenges and thoughts, but there's a lot to read. So Ada Gilbert will be buying 59 books from her local book publisher and not Amazon. And a lot of reading.
Someone said to me, they said, who's going to fill Rabbi Sacks's shoes? And my response was what they said when Harry Chapin passed away. He said, don't try and fill Rabbi Sacks's shoes, try and fill your own shoes because of Rabbi Sacks.
Thank you. So lots of reading, lots of resources. If you haven't had a chance to read materials by Rabbi Sacks, I'll make some available, and there's some that LSJS will make available, and there's a website. I'll share all of this in a follow-up email. I want to thank Rabbi Zarum. Rabbi Zarum will be back. We're doing a program, I think, in the spring. I have the date somewhere, or maybe early summer, on Rabbi Visits the Sistine Chapel. So,
oh, yes, that's a lot of fun.
So hopefully you'll join us for that program, and hopefully many more. It's really a treat to have, the COVID has taken away a lot of things, but it's brought us this relationship with Rabbi Zarum and there's great teachers around the world, and particularly in the UK. And we had Gila Fine teach us from Israel, and I know she's connected and teaches for you guys as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And worked with Rabbi Sacks, and it was a great Torah teacher, great teacher for everybody. And so thank you for teaching, taking time to come to us late at night, and tell Jacqueline we really liked her artwork for Pesach. I'll share that with all of you as well. Take care, everybody. Be safe.
Thank you.
Get vaccinated. Wear your masks.
You.
Bye.
Good night. Be well.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you so much.